everyone. Welcome to the webinar of UN Environment, WWF, and UNESCO on protecting our World Heritage, how the insurance industry can help protect World Heritage sites. I'm Butch Bakani from UN Environment here in Geneva. I'm joined by my colleague, Olivia Fabry. And we also have our speakers today also include Guy Debonnet from the UNESCO World Heritage Center in Paris. And we also have Alma Roberts from the campaigns team at WWF UK. And we also have Barbara Spiegel from the Sustainable Finance team here in WWF in Switzerland, in Zurich. Before we start with the webinar, my colleague Olivia will just remind everyone of a few technical details to make sure that the whole webinar runs smoothly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us during today's webinar. A couple of technical points. All participants are muted and all panelists are unmuted, which means that we would like to ask panelists to mute themselves when they don't speak. Participants will have an opportunity, many opportunities in fact, to ask questions or raise comments. You can do that on the chat box, the text box on your computer. You can also raise your hand virtually and we will give you the floor orally. We will unmute yourself. So do not hesitate to do that throughout the webinar. We have plenty of time for Q&A and comments, and we look forward to hearing any views you have. Many thanks.
Thanks, Olivia. And for this morning, at least it's morning here in Europe, we have actually a good crowd of people from the Asia Pacific, from Australia and Japan, through to also Africa and some folks here in Europe. And later on this afternoon, we'll have folks from the Americas as well. So thank you for joining the webinar. For those of you who were on summer holiday, for those in the Northern Hemisphere, you may have visited some of the World Heritage sites, whether cultural or natural. So it's quite fitting that we're going to be talking about them. Welcome back. And for those who were on winter holiday, you may have seen some as well. Without further ado, I think we'll start with the fundamentals of the whole agenda. What are World Heritage sites? What's the convention behind it? And what is the UNESCO doing to make sure that that convention is implemented? So we'll start with the fundamentals, and at this point, I'm going to be calling on my UN colleague from UNESCO, Guy, to share with us his thoughts on World Heritage. Guy, take it away.
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everybody. So, as Butch has mentioned, my name is Guy Debonnet. I work at the UNESCO at the World Heritage Center, which is the secretariat to the World Heritage Convention, and I'm very pleased to be here and to talk about World Heritage. We also are very pleased about this partnership with UNPSI to work to get more commitment from the insurance sector on the protection of World Heritage sites, because I think although the convention is of course something that is signed by states, I think increasingly the private sector has a very important role to play on in protecting the World Heritage sites. I think most of you know about World Heritage sites and the World Heritage Convention. This is a convention that was created with the basic idea of that there are some places in this world that are so important that we need to conserve them at all costs. And the main instrument of this convention is the World Heritage List, and this list includes some of the most famous and most known natural and cultural sites in the world. They include monuments, they include historic cities, they also include cultural landscapes, and of course we have a very important subset also of natural sites that are inscribed on the World Heritage List because of their importance for biodiversity, for ecosystems, or their geological importance. I think we can go to the next slide. So just a little bit background to the convention. The convention was adopted by UNESCO in 1972. It came immediately after the Stockholm Convention, the Stockholm meeting, the first big international meeting where there was on the human environment, where basically for the first time it was recognized that there was a need at the global level to look at the conservation of environmental issues. Today we have almost global coverage. We have 193 countries that have ratified the convention, which is a very high number. I think only CBD has more state parties, but at the same time we also have the United States as one of the signing up to the convention. It is interesting that this convention in one instrument actually talks about the conservation of cultural sites and also about the conservation of natural sites. In fact, in the run-up to the convention, there were two movements for two international instruments, one to protect cultural sites of international significance and one to give international status to the most important national parks at the time. And these two initiatives were merged and led to the World Heritage Convention. And I think it is an important aspect, because in the end, this is a heritage convention. It's of course also about biodiversity, but it's actually about people thinking that not only our own cultural expressions in terms of monuments and historic places are important, but that actually nature is also important in terms of our joint or common heritage. Yes, I think we can go to the next slide. So the World Heritage Convention being an international instrument, we have of course different procedures and way of working. We have every 2 years a General Assembly of all the countries that have signed up to the convention. They elect a World Heritage Committee that is making all strategic decisions in terms of the inscription of new sites, but also in terms of discussing the state of conservation of the existing sites. And then we have also a set of rules, which we call the operational guidelines, which basically set out the different mechanisms that the convention has in terms of the inscription of sites, in terms of how sites are evaluated and what is the role of scientific advisory bodies to get sites evaluated before having a decision to inscribe them on the list. Questions like modification of boundaries. Once sites are inscribed, they have an international status, so any change to them has to be also approved through the convention. I think a very important part is that this convention is not only about listing and then that's the end of it. No, there is the convention has actually an important mechanism to monitor the sites once they are inscribed. This means that UNESCO, together with its advisory bodies, can basically bring any issue which is related to the conservation of one of our sites to our governing bodies, in particular the World Heritage Committee. And in case the site is in danger of losing the values for which it was inscribed, the committee can decide to inscribe the site on the list in danger, or eventually, if a site would lose the reasons why it was inscribed, it can also be delisted. Next slide. The really basic concept of this convention is what we call in the terminology of the convention outstanding universal value. There is a very nice and complicated definition that is given on the slide, but I think the outstanding universal value has three aspects. First of all, we want sites with certain values, either natural or cultural values. For that, there are 10 criteria which determine, which lay out the reasons why sites can go on the World Heritage List. If we think of the natural sites, there are 4 criteria. One is the importance of for biodiversity. The other one is the importance in terms of ecosystems and ecosystem functioning. Another criteria is geological, sites that are exceptional in terms of geology. And the 4th criteria is about outstanding natural processes. So a good example is, for example, important, magnificent landscapes. So there are these 10 criteria which determine the values, but these values have to be outstanding. So they have to be really exceptional and universal. So basically exceptional at the world scale. I think this is an important philosophy of the convention. This is not a list to get any important sites in the world. No, the idea is really to get the most important, most significant sites having this international status, and therefore it is a limited list. Although the list is of course growing, and we have now a little bit more than 1,000 sites, out of which there are about 200 plus natural sites. But the real philosophy of the convention is that this is a list that should bring together all the most important sites that really deserve very special attention, and that really, for which the world as a whole, through the convention, agrees that these sites have to be preserved for the benefit of humankind as a whole, and also for the benefit of future generations. Next slide. I think there is also more and more recognition that this is a convention that is not only about protection, but also about sustainable development. The World Heritage Committee a few years ago decided on a strategy and a position paper on World Heritage and sustainable development. And of course, the World Heritage sites, we think, also contribute in a major way to several of the sustainable development goals. Of course, the most obvious ones are, especially for the natural sites, are the goal in terms of protection of life on Earth and life underwater. But also cultural sites. I think there is more and more recognition that also cultural sites have an important role in terms of the development of the communities where they are based. And interestingly, in the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which talks about sustainable cities and communities, there is a specific target set to ensure that both natural and cultural World Heritage sites are preserved. So I think there is this very clear and direct connection to this global agenda on sustainable development. Next slide. So yes, this is a list about the most important places, and but in spite of that, there are definitely also a lot of threats to these sites. One would expect that if a site gets on that list, it will be completely safe because of its globally recognized importance. But nevertheless, we see that increasingly also sites are under threat, both cultural sites and natural sites. The threats can vary. Some are linked to, of course, global issues like climate change. Climate change is going to have a profound impact on many of the natural sites, but also many of the cultural sites. But we also see all kinds of other kinds of threats that are happening to the sites. And a lot of these threats are linked to development projects that actually do not take into account the importance of these sites and the conservation of the sites. Examples are, of course, problems with extractive industries or other harmful industrial activities. So it is extremely important for the convention to ensure that we get a global attention to this issue, but also a global movement to protect at least these sites. I think We talk a lot in conservation about the thousands of protected areas that exist in the world and how it's important to save them. Well, we have 247 natural World Heritage Sites, which, although they do represent around 10% of the surface of protected areas in the world, they only represent less than 1% of the Earth's surface. And if we can't even ensure that these sites are preserved, the future looks pretty bleak for all our natural sites in general in the world. So I think this is a clear signal, and of course the first responsibilities lies with the governments that have signed up to the convention, that by proposing these sites for listing took on a clear commitment to protect these sites in front of the entire world community. But I think we are at a stage that we have to look broader. We have to ensure broad citizen support for the protection of these sites, and we also have to ensure that industry in all sectors is taking these sites into account when planning their projects and when negotiating their activities with governments. And that is, of course, the context where we see there is an important work to be done with the investment sectors, the investment community, and also with the global insurance community. Next slide. So I think we are at the question side. So I give it back to Butch, or I'm happy to answer any questions if there would be any.
Thank you so much, Guy, for explaining the fundamentals. I think it's really important that folks understand the convention and the guidelines and all the rationale behind it, and also the state of play right now. I think you mentioned the natural, World Heritage Sites are less than 1% of the Earth's surface, and actually science is telling us that protecting biodiversity and natural ecosystems around the world is as important as the fight against climate change, and the two are actually inextricably linked. So this is really at the heart of the sustainability agenda, and there's a role for folks to play. So we want to make sure that people have the chance to ask questions, especially we have an expert on this agenda like Guy on the webinar right now, and please let us know if you have any question. I thought I saw Serena raise her hand from QBE, or maybe it was just a mistake. But if there's anyone on the webinar who wants to ask Guy a question, now is the time to do so. Anyone? Oh, okay. So I think. Okay. I can't see it. So.
Right. So we have a question from Serena. It says, to what extent do governments have a responsibility to keep the sites protected for such harm?
Yes, of course. The basic philosophy of the convention is that countries take on a commitment for the protection of sites. That is why they sign up to the convention in the first place. And as I mentioned, we have a really global coverage of the convention. We have almost all countries in the world who have signed up to this convention. There are only a few island states in the Pacific, that are small island states in the Pacific that are currently have not yet ratified the convention. And then the mechanism is that actually the sites are proposed by the countries that have signed up to the convention. It's not UNESCO that says we should have this and this site on the list. It's not IUCN that says we should have this and this site on the list. It's actually the countries themselves that propose sites to be inscribed, that also have to propose a file to justify why they believe these sites are of this global importance. This is then evaluated on a scientific basis by our advisory bodies, which for the natural sites is IUCN, and then it's the committee that makes a decision on whether or not these sites can be inscribed on the World Heritage List. So the act of proposing these sites is an act that engages the country through the convention to do everything needed to protect this site. So yes, there is a very clear commitment of countries to protect sites. Of course, in the reality, we sometimes see that there is problems with this commitment. Sites are proposed often by ministries of environment or ministries of culture, and although they propose in the name of their government, and so it does engage the entire country, sometimes other ministries like a Ministry of Mine or can have other views, and there can be issues with the commitment. That is also why the convention has this very strong mechanism on monitoring to allow the committee to review the state of conservation of sites where there are issues, and to give recommendations to the countries involved to improve their record and to do the necessary to ensure that these sites are protected.
Thank you, Guy. I hope that was clear, Serena, the answer of Guy to your question. We'll pause also just in case there's any other question. Okay, so I think we can proceed. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Serena, for the question. And now I'm gonna be passing it to our WWF UK colleague Alma Roberts to run us through why WWF got involved in this. Alma?
Yes, thank you, and good morning or good day for everyone in the webinar. So WWF got involved in protecting these sites back in 2013 when we realized that a British oil company called SOCO had decided to drill inside the Virunga National Park, which is a natural World Heritage Site. So in October of 2013, WWF filed a complaint against this company, SOCO, under the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The company's commitment came following a mediation between the two parties as part of this process, and SOCO withdrew from Virunga National Park after concluding its current activities inside the park, which included seismic testing in Lake Edward. The company pledged to not drill for oil in the park, which WWF actually warned that could lead to a severe environmental damage. And with this engagement that we had with SOCO, on the side, we also began some work in engaging the financial institutions to get traction on the divestment and move a full, and we actually moved a full-time ad in the Financial Times, which you can actually see on the screen on your right. And so we actually got SOCO to commit not to drill inside the park, but also we got a feedback from them that this kind of process and mediation and everything was very expensive and painful experience for them that they wish not to repeat again. So it's interesting to see how this can actually be reputational risk for a company to go in such places as amazing as these sites. Can I have the next slide, please? But as stated before, WWF is not the only one that could have a position about entering these sites or not. The World Heritage Committee also has a very clear and consistent position on extractive companies. And in 2014, the committee responded to the global bank HSBC after they launched their policy on World Heritage sites, which this policy was drawn up in consultation with WWF. Can I have the next slide, please? And as of September of 2015, data showed WWF that the fastest growing threat to World Heritage sites is the extractive industry, as you can see on the slide. Can I have the next slide, please? So on the spring of 2016, WWF published a report to launch a global campaign to protect World Heritage sites. In this report, we saw from the data that we collected that half of these natural sites are threatened by harmful activities such as oil, mining, and gas as one of the main ones. But the report also showed that 11 million people living in or near World Heritage sites depend on these sites for food, water, medicine, and jobs. The report and the campaign got a lot of press worldwide, really focusing on what we were showing, that these sites, as Guy mentioned, even though they are definitely recognized, globally recognized for their outstanding universal value and the importance for our heritage, this still have a threat, and this was shown throughout throughout the world, as you can see. So the campaign wanted to showcase this issue by using 3 flagship campaigns. We used Doñana National Park in Spain, that had the threat of river dredging right next to it. We also used Belize Barrier Reef System, which had the issue of oil exploration. And we also used Selous Game Reserve as a flagship in Tanzania, which one of the main issues that it was poaching of elephants, but also had mining concessions, as well as currently it has a project, a hydropower project, a Stigler's Gorge Dam. Throughout the campaign, we've mobilized over 1.5 million people to take advocacy actions to prime ministers, presidents, and businesses as well. And so far, the outcomes that we've had is that for the Doñana National Park, we were able to halt the plans for, or cancel actually, the dredging plans that threaten this park. In case of the Belize Barrier Reef, we were able to work with the government of Belize and help them introduce a permanent oil moratorium in the Belizean waters. And for Selous in Tanzania, Tanzanian government has banned any form of mining inside the property. And as I mentioned before, we currently have the issue of the threat of a hydropower project called the Stigler's Gorge Dam. We also engaged with the investment, the financial institutions, and we had 13 additional global banks that have shared the World Heritage policies with the World Heritage Center. Can I have the next slide, please? And now I'm gonna have my colleague Barbara to explain a little bit of our engagement with the financial industry sector.
Thank you very much, Alma. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone on the phone. I'd like to give you a bit more detail of what it means in reality when such World Heritage sites are threatened by extractive activities. One case study we have done is on the company Grupo Mexico. It's the fourth largest copper producer in the world, but also does other extractives on lead, silver, zinc, and gold, and operates mostly in North and South America. To give you an example, Grupo Mexico currently has operations in 2 World Heritage sites. One is the Doñana National Park in Spain, and one is the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve in Mexico. Now, a bit more details to Doñana in Spain. Back in 1998, there was actually a very large burst of a holding dam, which led to one of Spain's worst ecological disasters, which resulted in $240 million of cleanup activities. What had happened is that with the burst of the dam, about 2 billion gallons of contaminated and highly acidic water, actually mixed together with arsenic and cadmium and other chemicals and waste metals, were poured into the river, into the Guadiamar River there. And that ended up causing 25,000 kilos of dead fish and 2,000 birds killed due to this chemical exposure. This mine is only about 45 kilometers from Doñana National Park, so it's in the peripheries of this World Heritage site. Basically, after that natural disaster, there was a bit of quietness for a few years, but recently, back in 2015, the government decided to kind of reopen that project, and Grupo Mexico went in and started basically with exploration again there in the year 2016. And we're expecting that new exploitation, really full commercial exploitation, may start there in 2020. The other example of Grupo Mexico, as I said, is the Monarch Butterfly Reserve in Mexico. Basically, this is a small town in Mexico in the middle of the World Heritage site, and again, Grupo Mexico is in there with an investment, I believe, of a couple hundred millions. So again, definitely a site where we feel strongly it should not be operated in. The mining there had actually been closed for a while, but actually Grupo Mexico claims that it wasn't truly closed, and although it had been inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2008, Grupo Mexico believes it's okay to keep drilling there. Moving on to the next slide, please. The other example, as Alma already has briefly mentioned, is Selous National Park in Tanzania. This national park has been awarded World Heritage Site status back in 1982. And at that time, it was actually one of the sites with the most significant concentrations of elephants, African elephants, black rhinoceros, hippopotamus, giraffe, and cheetah in the world. This game reserve, you can imagine, it's about the size of Denmark. And it's really one of the very few remaining areas in Africa that's relatively uninhabited and really undisturbed natural area. Now, unfortunately, back in 2009, there was a legislative revision, which meant that the government basically decided that extractive concessions were okay again. And during that time, extractive activities, of course, skyrocketed in that area. Now, on the screen, you can actually see an extract of an IT tool that WWF has developed, where we can basically see protected areas such as World Heritage Sites, and we can overlap them with extractive activities and oil and gas activities. And through this analysis of this tool, we actually have identified 5 active mines within that game reserve and over 50 mining concessions, which are owned by 23 direct owners. So we actually do know there's quite a lot of things going on there. Recently, the government has actually pledged to remove mining concessions again there. So there's a fight going on there, but as my colleague Alma has said, the World Heritage Site is in fact in danger because of another project called the Stiegler's Gorge, which is a plan for a very, very large hydropower dam in the middle of this natural heritage site. Moving on to the next slide, and the question was already kind of asked. Now, how can it be that this, just less than 1% of the Earth's surface, which 193 countries decide are the most precious natural sites in the world, how is it possible that there's still extractive activities and other commercial harmful activities there? Now, it's mainly 3 main factors we've identified. On the one side, as we already discussed, it's governments that are actually inviting industrial companies to come there. We've heard already that within governments, not all may have the same opinion, while the environmental arm of the government may try to protect. The financial ministry may have different opinions on that. So it's often governments themselves actually asking for companies to extract there. Secondly, it's of course the companies themselves that are either simply not knowing about protected status, or they are unconcerned about it, where economic gain is valued higher than the protection of the site. And thirdly, it's of course financial institutions, and with that we mean investors, banks, and also insurance companies who very often unwittingly find themselves lending, insuring, and investing in such projects. And again, unwittingly, we're very aware that sometimes literally the information is not there, the data may not be there, and it's not always known that a project that's financed is actually quite harmful and directly within such a protected site. Moving on to my last slide, just to explain a bit more the journey of we now got to working with colleagues at PSI and UNESCO. Alma explained it started all with the SOCO case, which led actually to several companies, including several banks, that we worked with, strengthening their policies around lending and investing to companies active in World Heritage Sites. That led to 2 reports. One is Safeguarding Outstanding Natural Value that WWF worked on together with the Church of England, and also another specific report published in 2017, specifically how banks can safeguard the World Heritage, which really explains what would a policy have to look like, how can such policies be implemented, etc. These 2 reports, if you Google them, they're freely available online. And really after putting the first focus on banks and investors, we're now at a stage where we really are pleased to start engaging with the insurance companies to really collaboratively find solutions to make sure that you don't find yourselves insuring companies that are in such sites. So very pleased to start launching this campaign now. And at this point, I'm gonna just open it for questions also. Butch, if you wanna, and Olivia, if you wanna take over again.
Yes, thank you, Alma, and thanks, Barbara, for explaining all the reasons why WW got involved in this agenda and also this engagement with the financial sector. So, if there's any question from participants, we would welcome them now. Okay, so if there's none, we'll proceed. And there's another segment later on after my slides to ask questions. Okay, so this brings us to this initiative with the PSI, WWF, and UNESCO, which we launched at the World Heritage Committee annual session in Manama, Bahrain last July. So for those of you who are familiar with the climate change agenda, I mean, the biggest event that happens every year is the UN Climate Change Conference. This year is going to be in Poland. So the equivalent of that is the World Heritage Committee meeting that happened in Bahrain last July. And so that's the place where we launched the initiative. The initiative really is actually a very complete one because it covers the risk management, insurance, and investment activities of the insurance industry. So this is the triple role that the insurance industry really has in its capacity to address sustainability issues, be it climate change or biodiversity or human rights, through to World Heritage Sites and tobacco, for example. So the agenda is something that we crafted together with PSI members, insurers, WWF, and UNESCO. So we felt it was the right time this year, given the momentum that was built already by WWF on this agenda, engaging with individual banks initially, but now also moving on to the insurance industry as risk managers, insurers, and investors. And this is really a novel thing because I don't think there's been any engagement with the insurance industry like this before, and also in a way that it's industry-wide rather than a company-by-company engagement. Next slide, please. So what are these commitments? And basically, there's 5 actions to be taken and 5 goals. The first one could really be summarized as a data and knowledge goal. How do you bridge the data gap? Barbara mentioned already that there are already data gaps there about, World Heritage Sites. People are unaware, companies are unaware, and financial institutions are unaware. But at the same time, there's also the agenda of informing yourself better and building knowledge on this agenda. And this is the reason why we started this webinar today with basics on the convention and the operating guidelines, etc., that was given by Guy. The second action is really an awareness raising goal. So PSI members signed the 4 principles for sustainable insurance, and one of them is to engage key stakeholders on environmental, social, and governance issues. So this is simply a World Heritage Site equivalent of that principle 3, to support widespread action and raise awareness on this issue. So as it was very clear also from the WWF presentation, that this is not simply a financial sector agenda. It involves government, it involves companies, and it involves individual citizens like you and me. So there is an agenda to make this a whole of society agenda and engaging with others. The next action is really what I would say a prevention and reduction goal. How do you actually reduce the risk of insuring and or investing in companies and projects whose activities could damage World Heritage Sites? So there's a whole series of steps that can be taken. You can develop a World Heritage Site policy like what Barclays and Standard Bank have done. You can have specific guidelines and frameworks. I mean, the fact that insurers have already signed the principles for sustainable insurance or the principles for responsible investment are really important starting points to drill more into this agenda of World Heritage Sites, whether it's cultural or natural. And the fourth one is really a protection goal. There are ways that insurers can address and protect World Heritage Sites, for example, risk analytics, risk modeling, that by insurers, to what extent are coral reefs, for example, valued or captured in risk models and analytics or forests, and these are also wetlands, for example. How are these captured in risk analytics? Insurance products, obviously, it's a no-brainer. There could be insurance for property, environmental liability, insurance of natural ecosystems, for example, whether it's a coral reef or a forest, etc. These are all possible opportunities for the insurance industry to contribute to the agenda. And it could also be simply insuring, for example, low carbon technologies, which actually reduce pollution and have benefits for World Heritage Sites as well. And obviously, insurance is one angle, but also the power of insurance companies as institutional investors. Globally, the industry manages 30 trillion in assets under management. So how that capital is invested is actually will have a telling impact as well as far as these sites are concerned. And along with that, is the fifth action is really an engagement goal, whether insurance activities or investment activities, to what extent can insurers be able to engage with companies to improve their disclosure of any activity that could damage these sites, and how also it's not simply a disclosure agenda, it's also how engagement could be a tool for clients to adopt and adhere to industry standards to protect these places. And one example is actually the mining industry members of the International Council of Mining and Metals. They made a no-go commitment that applies to all their members, preventing extractive industry activities in World Heritage Sites. So that's an example of an industry standard that could be encouraged by insurers as insurers and investors when they engage with companies. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're citing Swiss Re as an example. I mean, Swiss Re is one of those companies which came out publicly, one of the first ones, on a sustainability risk framework that applies to their insurance and investment transactions. And if you look at this is all public, and if you look at what Swiss Re is saying, this is for them a direct implementation of the principles for sustainable insurance in their core risk management, insurance, and investment activities. So the Swiss Re framework actually has umbrella policies that covers beyond the environment. It also covers human rights. And many of these instances, actually, there is a connection between issues like child labor, for example, and the environment. And there's also very specific guidelines on industry sectors, including mining and dams, as you can see on the slide. So let's move on to slide 27. If we go deeper into Swiss Re's framework, you can see that, for example, their guidelines on dam really highlight human rights issues like poor living and working conditions, and both the environmental agenda of destruction of local habitat. And obviously, it's something that also links to cultural UNESCO World Heritage Site and biodiversity as issues. We go on to the next slide. You can also see that Swiss Re's guidelines also focus on mining as another example, where again, issues like child labor, human rights, health and safety are taken into account side by side with protected areas, and issues like free, prior, and informed consent from local communities when activities are happening near or around these sites. Moving further, I mean, Swiss Re has developed a process internally on how they're going to be able to manage this. We do appreciate that there's a lot of insurance policies and reinsurance transactions, whether it's obviously you can see more the risk on facultative reinsurance, on a per risk reinsurance, but treaty reinsurance transactions are also, there's just a lot of things that are ceded to reinsurers, and it's just important to have a mechanism in place on how both insurance and investment transactions are actually addressed, particularly for global companies like Swiss Re. Next slide, please. And a bit of the stats. I think it's also just shows, based on Swiss Re's experience, that a lot of the a big proportion of risks deferred have been related, unsurprisingly, with mining activities, oil and gas, and dams. So this is pretty much in line with the WWF presentation on this agenda. Let's move on to other relevant activities. So it doesn't mean that everyone immediately from day one has to be a Swiss Re and do these things all together, but it goes to show that this agenda takes time to evolve within the company. I mean, I spoke with Swiss Re from, basically the time they were developing their framework years ago, and that has matured, and others have also developed their own sustainability frameworks. It's not only Swiss Re, but I think we can learn a lot from the Swiss Re experience. And at the same time, this is not simply a Swiss Re agenda. They actually want, together with companies like Allianz, Munich Re, and others, they want this to be an industry-wide agenda. And this is the reason why the PSI is actually developing the first ever global guidance to manage environmental, social, and governance risk in insurance underwriting, with a focus on non-life business. It does not exist at the moment. You have something for project finance and the IFC Equator Principles. You have guidelines across asset classes through the Principles for Responsible Investment, but there's nothing out there for non-life, for example, on insurance underwriting across these issues. So this is something that we are developing. This an initiative, a global initiative led by Allianz. We've already interviewed underwriters around the world. We've engaged underwriters and chief risk officers on this agenda in different events, and we've also done a global survey recently to get views from underwriters and key stakeholders in this agenda. And actually, we already have a date for the launch. It's going to be February 27 next year at the Allianz headquarters in Munich. We will be launching this guidance, and this guidance is something that would encompass a wide range of ESG issues, and one of them are World Heritage sites and human rights issues as well. Next slide, please. That's not the only PSI collaborative initiative that's relevant. We also, Guy already mentioned the link to the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly Sustainable Development Goal 11, which says to make cities safe, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And you have a specific target there to protect natural and cultural heritage sites. So many insurers, investors, banks, and the wider business community are aligning themselves with the SDGs in terms of their strategy, and this is one of them. This is one way to align yourself with promoting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we launched these insurance industry development goals at the World Congress, ICLE World Congress of Cities in Montreal last July, after a year-long consultation. If you move on to the next slide, you can see that there are 10 goals, and one of them is really spot on protecting natural and cultural heritage sites. Obviously, there's going to be intersection with other goals, For example, Goal 1 on building climate and disaster resilience. That could include healthy ecosystems, natural ecosystems that could help buffer storm surge. Could be a World Heritage Site, for example. So there's a lot of overlap there, but there's a very specific goal on protecting natural and cultural heritage sites. And we're very happy that mayors that we have engaged, local government officials, are opening their eyes and their minds actually to the fact that insurers in their communities and cities can actually play a role in promoting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal on cities. Next slide, please. So, what does the statement mean? So, really, the bottom line is that the statement of commitment that we have developed with WWF, UNESCO, and PSI members is really the starting point to commit to take action. It does not necessarily mean that everyone who signs on to it is fully aware of all the insurance and investment transactions that they are covering, and in relation to World Heritage Sites, but it is a commitment to take action. And that starts with signing the commitment, saying that I will enhance my knowledge on this issue. I will start looking into beyond the signing the principles for sustainable insurance, looking at whether we could develop a policy on World Heritage Sites in our company that would address insurance and investment transactions. It's also working with your clients and your stakeholders, with your peers in the insurance industry, to say, why don't we do something on this? Why don't we talk to our National Insurance Association and say we should be putting this agenda on the table and promoting widespread action in this, and also supporting intergovernmental processes like, for example, the World Heritage Committee meeting and what UNESCO is doing, for example. So, so this is really, I think that you should treat this in the same way that you treat the PSI. When the 4 principles for sustainable insurance were launched, no one knew how to implement them. These are voluntary and aspirational principles, and it's really a work in progress for an organization to get into this space. It doesn't mean that you need to have everything in place before you sign on. It's actually the contrary. The first thing is to sign on and say, we will make this commitment, and we will work together with UNESCO, with WWF and UNEP and our peers in the insurance industry to bring this agenda forward and to find ways to address this matter more effectively. And the bottom line really is that no one company can address this challenge on its own. The same agenda with climate change, the same agenda with the whole biodiversity space or human rights space. It is a collective agenda, and there is strength in numbers for us. And gladly, fortunately, we're happy that there are already a bunch of institutions who are signed the statement, and you have a chance, if you haven't signed the statements, to be a founding signatory on this, to show your commitment. It's something that we will be actively promoting. We will be working with you in developing the next steps of this engagement. Next slide, please. So signing it, there's just a couple of categories, just like the PSI. So there's companies themselves, so insurers and reinsurers and brokers, and companies that provide services to insurance and reinsurance companies, including risk model vendors, for example. And then you have supporting institutions. So if you are an insurance association or even an insurance regulator or an NGO that's engaging with the insurance industry, you definitely can also sign it as a supporting institution. We have the deadline at the end of October. So we made sure that we go past at least here in the north, the summer holidays, so that people have time to actually come back from holidays and actually engage with their go through their internal processes to make sure that they are able to go through the steps internally to be able to sign the statement. And the process is very simple. Anyone, a person in the company can simply email us saying we'd like to sign the statement, and that's it. And we would just have assumed that you would have gone through your respective internal processes in terms of getting sign off to become a founding signatory. And this is really something that is a leadership agenda. This is something that it's a novel initiative. No initiative out there is working on this agenda in the same way that the PSI is doing it with WF and UNESCO. And you actually have the key stakeholders in this initiative who will be working with us collaboratively on this issue. So what are the next steps for us? So this webinar is an example, and we can continue to progress as the initiative carries on with more webinars and also highlighting these events. One of the things that the PSI is already planning for next year, for example, is we want to convene insurers, leading insurers around the world, and also mayors and local government officials to come together and see what are the best ways to implement the insurance industry development goals for cities, and within that context, address also the issue of protecting natural and cultural heritage in that agenda. So that's one thing. Where we also have a plan with WWF and also supported by UNESCO to develop guidance. The statement is really a statement of commitment to take action, but we need to go more granular with guidance, and this is something that we'd like to work with insurers on. Obviously, you are the ones who know your business and portfolios best, but we also wanted to understand what are the best ways to develop guidance that is fit for purpose and applies to the business model of insurance companies. And that also includes potentially looking into the agenda of developing environmental risk management tools that are tailored for insurance, for the insurance business across investment management and insurance underwriting as well. We know that WWF has an internal tool at the moment that they're using, WWF site. We also know that there's the integrated biodiversity assessment tool that's being used by some companies, but by and large, there's nothing that's really specific for insurers that has been custom made. And that's an agenda that we can also look into. And obviously, since we have UNESCO as our partner, we have a gateway to the World Heritage Committee meeting. So this is like the big event every year on World Heritage sites. And we have the chance to actually put this agenda on the table and say, from the time we launched it in Bahrain, we have made progress as an agenda. And this is how the insurance industry across the world is supporting the agenda of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee and supporting the World Heritage Convention and the operating guidelines. So in the same way, an analogy would be in the whole climate change context. Before, it was simply an intergovernmental agenda, but now you have the notion of climate finance, the notion of insurance for climate resilience. That agenda is not yet well developed in the World Heritage community, and this is a chance for the insurance industry, for folks like yourselves, to exercise leadership and show that this is what the insurance industry can do across its risk management, insurance, and investment activities. So I think that's the last slide we have. I just wanted to make sure that Barbara and Alma have a chance to add on anything that may have been missed, particularly on the next steps on what we will be doing going forward. Barbara?
Thanks very much, Butch. I don't think anything's been missed. I think it's been explained very, very well. I just want to reiterate once more that really at this point in time, it's really a great opportunity to start collaborating. And as Butch said, the first step is to sign the statement. We do not expect everyone to be perfect and to not have a single client on the list that may be involved in activities within such sites. But it really means developing guidance together, figuring out what the insurance sector's role is, because I believe the insurances, in fact, can do even more than banks, because they're both institutional investors and insurers and risk managers. And so developing guidance and also working together to get that data that you need. And I think it's really important we get several companies supporting that, because the more companies asking for the data, the quicker we'll get it, the cheaper we'll get it. And I think it's definitely something that can be solved collaboratively. So definitely once more encouragement from my side, yeah, to sign up and to start working on it together.
Thank you, Barbara. And this is really a time, for questions from anyone on anything that has been discussed, whether it was UNESCO, WWF, or us here at UNAP, for any question that you may have. Okay, so I think we're good. I don't see anyone raising her or his hand virtually, and obviously this is not the simply a one-shot deal. So if you have questions later on, you can email us, and we will continue to update the membership about progress on this. But the key thing, the key takeaway really is that this is a chance for a collaborative initiative. There is strength in numbers, and we would like to make sure that we get a critical mass of signatories from around the world, ideally unified on this agenda, and a chance to actually shape guidance that's tailored for the insurance business, together with UNESCO and WWF and your peers. And also, as I mentioned earlier, a chance to really work together with others and drive this agenda as we pursue the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals or other relevant initiatives on underwriting or on cities that the PSI is undertaking. So this is the best way for us. The most effective way to do this is to work together rather than waiting for individual companies to do things on their own. It will take a much longer exercise, more resources to do that individually. And this is why also the PSI exists. It's really not simply embracing the 4 principles for sustainable insurance and implementing on their own, but also we've built a community of practice based on the PSI, and these issues have core sustainability issues have been flagged by members. One of them is this, World Heritage Sites. Another one obviously is climate change. Another one is tobacco and resilience. So I think these are core issues from the membership, and this is really a chance for everyone to chime in and say, we want to be part of that and we want to work together with others. Yeah. Okay, so there is actually a question from Petra Holden. Petra is asking, I would like more clarity on what the data speakers are mentioning. Barbara, you mentioned that earlier. I think you want to expand on that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd be very happy. So basically on the data, maybe I briefly explain what the WWF site tool is and what it can do. So really what we've done with a site is we've overlapped 3 data layers. The first data layer is protected areas. One of the protected areas is World Heritage sites, but there's of course others like different IUCN sites, Ramsar sites, etc. And the second data layer we've then taken is we've actually looked at mining data, oil and gas data, and we in fact even looked at some other data like roads and hydro dams, etc. And then the third data layer is really figuring out, okay, who are the owners or who are the parent companies between these concessions. And from there, of course, then it's not so difficult to find out who's investing. So it's really what we've done is we've overlaid several data sets, and what allows this allows us to basically open a tool that looks almost like Google Maps, where we can zoom in and we can see, okay, in this area within Selous National Reserve, we can literally see on Google Maps, there is an open pit. What we can also do is we can put in company names, and we can see that a certain company might have 300 oil concessions, and maybe 20 of those are within protected areas. So it's actually quite a convenient tool. The only thing is it's only an internal tool for WWF. We're also getting the data very inexpensively because we're an NGO, but that means we cannot use that data in a commercial way. Now, we've been working quite heavily with various different partners, including various UN organizations also, to make sure we now find a solution that we build a very similar tool, or maybe even a slightly different one, depending on what the insurance and banking industry specifically needs, and to make this data commercially available. And again, with you giving us an indication that you're interested in this topic and signing up to this commitment, we'd be really pleased to work one-on-one with you to figure out what type of tool would you need, what type of information would you need in there, and then we'd also like to help really find the right provider that can offer such a tool.
Right. Thank you, Barbara. So it's really environmental and development data sets that we are referring to, and really, I mean, this is really very core to the agenda, because particularly for international and global insurance, where there's thousands, if not millions, of insurance and investment transactions, how do you start monitoring these risks across your insurance and investment portfolios? And those tools are the tools that we would like to explore together with the insurance industry on how such tools could be developed. Okay. I'm happy that Petra is happy with the answer. Last chance for question. We still have 10 minutes for any question. Okay, so I think with that, we can end the webinar. Thank you very much for joining this journey. Just a reminder, so the first step is to make a commitment to take action. The deadline is the end of October. I think the sooner you start the process externally, the better. And after that, there will be communications around the founding signatories in early November. And we will also carry on already with the founding signatories the next steps in developing guidance on this, and also contributing to collaborative initiatives of the PSI, particularly the Alliance-led global initiative on developing guidance for non-life insurance underwriting on ESG issues. So we'd like to be able to contribute to that process as well. So we've saved 9 minutes of your time, and so thank you very much. And for those in Australia and Japan and the Asia Pacific, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good evening. And for those in Europe and Africa, enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.